You weren't supposed to see this. The AMR26 wasn't part of the original schedule. Not on day 4. Not with only one session left. But with just under an hour to go, the car appeared, quiet, black, and almost anonymous. No branding. No build-up. No press. Only Lance Stroll in the cockpit, and Adrian Newey watching from pit wall. The car rolled out of the garage as if it were any other shakedown. But it wasn't. Because what happened next, according to 3 separate engineers, broke every assumption they had about Aston Martin's pace and their intentions. The AMR26 didn't light up the timing screens. It wasn't about that. It was the way the car behaved. How it entered turn 5 without correction. How it transitioned through turn 9 like it had more downforce than the regulations even allow. And then, without warning, it stopped. Right there on track. No smoke. No noise. Just a sudden shutdown that triggered a red flag and ended the session. The team gave no explanation. But minutes after the checkered flag, a private conversation took place in the paddock, between someone on the Aston Martin side, and someone from Mercedes. The quote? Newey told Alonso the numbers are real, if it runs clean, they're half a second up. Now, that might sound like arrogance. Or hype. Or just Newey being Newey. But what if he's right? Because if this car really is half a second faster, despite running only 4 laps, despite stopping on track, despite carrying weight and unfinished maps, then the biggest threat in 2026 just revealed itself. And almost no one noticed. Aston Martin called it routine. Just a basic systems test. Limited laps. No aero upgrades. Nothing experimental. That was the official line. But nothing about day 4 looked routine. Not the timing. Not the secrecy. And definitely not the people standing at the edge of the garage. Because if this was truly just a rollout, why was Adrian Newey there, watching every second of it unfold? Newey isn't just a figurehead. He doesn't show up unless something matters. And on day 4, he wasn't just present. He was focused. Locked in. Almost studying the car as if he hadn't built it, but was trying to understand it. The AMR26 came out late. So late, in fact, that it missed most of the clean running window. Wind was picking up. Track temp had dropped. Most teams were packing up. But Aston Martin waited. Not by accident, by design. They rolled the car out slowly. No engineers scrambling. No final checks in view. It was almost theatrical. Like they knew everyone would be watching, but only for a moment. And when the car pulled away, there were no launch maps. No limiter issues. Just clean, silent acceleration and one timed lap. Then it stopped. Right there. No drama. Just a message. And that's what has teams talking. Because when a car runs that quietly, that late, and only for long enough to be seen, what you're witnessing isn't a test. It's a warning. There was no formal debrief. No press conference. No statement from Fernando Alonso. But there was a conversation. It didn't happen in front of cameras. It didn't need to. Because the paddock is always listening. And what was said between Newey and Alonso after that single lap didn't stay private for long. According to 2 independent sources, Newey didn't mince words. He told Alonso the car simulation was underreporting cornering loads. That what they saw on track was better than expected. And then he said it, calm, direct, quiet. If we clean up the mapping, we're half a second faster. That number didn't stay between them. By nightfall, 3 teams had already started combing through footage of the AMR26's run. Not for speed. Not for raw lap time. But for signs of something hidden. And what they found raised even more questions. The steering angle into turn 5 was reduced. Stroll barely corrected on exit. Lateral load appeared unnaturally stable, almost like the car was anticipating the shift before it happened. Now, that could be balance. Could be driver comfort. Could be nothing. But for engineers who've spent the last 2 seasons trying to tame rear instability in low-speed corners, that behavior didn't look random. It looked designed. That's when the leak turned into a theory. Not that Aston Martin had built a faster car, but that they discovered a method of stabilizing cornering load, without active components, without floor movement, and without triggering the FIA sensors. And if that's true, then this wasn't just a promising lap. It was a glimpse at something the rest of the grid still doesn't understand. At first glance, nothing on the AMR26 violates FIA regulations. The bodywork is static. The suspension mounts are fixed. The load tests were passed. But that's only what the regulations can see. And what's happening underneath might be something they were never built to detect. According to one senior engineer reviewing the footage, the AMR26 showed signs of predictive chassis behavior. Not reactive. Not passive. Predictive. Now, there's nothing in the 2026 rulebook that bans it. Because no one expected it. The regulations are written to control what moves, not what thinks. But if Aston Martin has found a way to use cornering data, live or pre-encoded, to prepare the structural response of the chassis before the car reaches load threshold, that's not active suspension. That's anticipatory geometry. And there's no clause for that. No sensor designed to catch it. No testing protocol that even asks that question. It's not illegal. Because it's not understood. And this is where the gray area opens up. Not in the parts you can measure, but in the behavior you can't repeat. Because when a system performs differently on track than it does in static simulation, you've entered a zone the FIA can't fully control. And that's where Aston Martin might have built their advantage. In a place between definitions. Where the code doesn't say yes, and doesn't say no. Just silence. The FIA hasn't made a statement. They rarely do when something this subtle happens. But inside the organization, there's already discomfort. Not because of what Aston Martin did, but because of what they didn't do. They didn't file for exemptions. Didn't request clarifications. Didn't submit any last-minute changes. Which, under normal circumstances, would suggest everything's clean. But that's what's so unsettling. The AMR26 passed through every checkpoint. Without resistance. There were no warning signs. No procedural flags. No odd telemetry until the car hit the track. And that's when it became clear. Something about this car doesn't match the paperwork. Not illegally. Not explicitly. But fundamentally. The FIA depends on systems that compare declared performance to real-world behavior. When those two match, everyone feels safe. But when they don't, and the software shows stability in conditions that should produce instability, something is being hidden. The governing body has tools to measure power, aero load, even ride height changes. But they don't have tools to measure intent. They can't detect whether a team meant to deceive. They can only detect whether the data makes sense. And right now, it doesn't. That's what really worries them. Not that a rule was broken, but that they're no longer sure what to look for. And when a car starts operating in a language the regulations don't speak, that's not a breach. It's an evolution. An evolution they weren't prepared for. Aston Martin hasn't been accused of anything. Not publicly. Not formally. But inside every other garage, their data is under review. McLaren has already reanalyzed the high-speed camera footage from Turn 8. Ferrari is cross-checking vertical oscillation across similar lap temperatures. Red Bull? They're silent. But they've started modifying their CFD baselines. Because whether or not Aston Martin broke a rule, they clearly found something. Something the others missed. And in Formula One, that's all it takes to trigger panic. Not because one car is faster, but because no one knows why. That uncertainty is already affecting development. Two teams have reportedly frozen elements of their 2026 floor philosophy. One has delayed a rear suspension update by 3 weeks. They're not adjusting for lap time. They're adjusting for fear. Because if Aston Martin has discovered a way to manipulate aero balance through passive load redistribution, then every other car is already obsolete. At least conceptually. And worse, if it's legal, they have no grounds to protest it. So now, everyone's in a holding pattern. Waiting. Watching. Running models based on a single lap and an unfinished map. That's not racing strategy. That's containment. Because once one team bends the system without breaking it, the rest have two choices. Adapt, or pray the FIA finds a reason to stop it. Right now, the AMR26 hasn't shown its full potential. No qualifying run. No race simulation. Not even a second session. Just a few laps. One timed. And a silence that speaks louder than any press release. But within that silence, something's been set in motion. Because if that car is already half a second faster, while running incomplete software, carrying extra weight, and using a conservative fuel load, then what happens when it's optimized? When they remove the limiter? When Alonso gets a full weekend to dial it in? We're not talking about podiums anymore. We're talking about shift. Structural, regulatory, and political. Because the FIA now faces a problem it can't measure. Not in kilowatts. Not in airflow. Not in decibels. It's a problem of precedent. Letting this car run as is, without clarification, sends a message to every team. That if you're clever enough, subtle enough, and fast enough, you can move ahead without waiting for approval. That's not rule breaking. It's rule setting. And Aston Martin may have just done exactly that. Because if this car is real, if that half second isn't just theoretical, then 2026 is already taking shape. Not in the wind tunnel. Not in simulation. But on a quiet Thursday afternoon. With one car? And no explanation. And that's the kind of threat no one is ready to face.